I'm Brenda Kleinjan from Sioux Valley Energy in Coleman, South Dakota. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Support for this podcast comes from Nokia, which is committed to America's electric cooperatives by empowering them for the new energy future. Nokia creates technology that helps the world act together. As a trusted partner of electric utilities for critical networks, they are committed to innovation and technology leadership across mobile, fixed, and cloud networks.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so we're going to spend this episode talking about what an electric cooperative's internal and operational networks might look like to a hacker, and what co-ops can do to tighten their defenses. Today, we're talking with Ryan Newlon, NRECA's Cybersecurity Solutions Principal, and Bryan Hatton, a cybersecurity researcher at the Idaho National Laboratory. Part of Bryan's work includes what's called white hat hacking, which involves breaking into a computer network to identify vulnerabilities. A quick note before we start, you're going to hear a few acronyms in this episode, and I wanted to set some of those up. One of them is ICS CERT. That's the Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. That's part of CISA, C-I-S-A, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, Ryan and Bryan, welcome to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay, Ryan, I want to start with you and first sort of set this up with a high-level look at the co-op systems that hackers might be interested in attacking, what you would probably call the attack surface. Can you talk sort of broadly, without getting into too much detail, about the platforms that electric cooperatives are running that might be targets for hackers?
Sure. I think it's important at this point to identify what an attack surface or a threat surface really is. And basically, it's a device that communicates in any way in that environment. Right. So if you put an IP address, protocol, whatever it is, anything that can traverse or communicate across a network would be a threat surface. And identifying that, I think there's 4 basic areas that I would focus on for a co-op. Those 4 areas are SCADA, the IT environment, wireless, and the home. And when I talk about the SCADA environment, I'm talking about the supervisory control and data acquisition, for those that don't know what the SCADA piece is. But there's main systems on there that control the environment, like a SCADA master. That would be something that would be a target, like a main target. And to avoid all the acronyms on all the different stuff of PLC, ICS, all the things, I'm going to go into the idea of what the device is and what they're actually trying to go for. So the data on the environment, for the SCADA environment, they're looking for data. A pivot point, like a device that doesn't have as much security built into it that they could pivot or attack and then attack other things within the network. There's those devices that have common passwords that haven't been changed. I don't think it's important because they're a small device that makes them a target. And then anything that can disrupt the services, right? Like a recloser, something like that that could bring actual power down. So that kind of addresses the first area of SCADA. Second one is the IT environment, which we're all a little bit more comfortable with and have knowledge on. But in the IT environment, some of the devices, the things that you should be looking for is the domain controller. That's the holy grail. They get your domain controller, it's game over at that point. But network devices, those are critical to your environment in the IT information technology space. And then the other one that I want to point out in the IT environment is the user accounts, right? They're always trying to compromise user accounts. And if they get the domain admin account, then it's pretty much game over because they have access into your environment. The third one that I think is very important is wireless. We all want to build in wireless for the convenience of being able to pull your laptop, go to the conference room and communicate. But what that's doing is just extending our networks and increasing that threat surface because now you're putting mobile devices on there, tablets, phones, things of that nature. But you also have the complexity that you can't forget about, which is the configuration of the components that do that. Wireless access controller, the access points themselves. And then finally, what I would say is the home and personal devices. This day and age, we like the remote connections and we have VPN and we can work from all over. But the day of COVID and the day of remote working and the way that we're changing our environment, we are now extending our work environments over to the home. And that increases our threat surface. And the last point I want to make on that is as we look at all 4 of those that I gave you, you have to build observability into it. And you have to know what right looks like and you have to know what's going on with it.
Bryan, let's turn it to you for sort of the hacker's point of view. What are some of the ways the hackers might go about getting into these systems that Ryan was just talking about?
So I do want to actually emphasize on some of the things that Ryan said. One of the things he talked about was unused and default passwords. And as I was working at ICS CERT, I remember actually having incidences where things like that actually did happen. And we had to reach out to institutes that had an account set up that was part of the default installation. However, they never actually changed the password. In fact, the integrator didn't even realize that account and password was part of the system set up. And so they used that as an entryway in. On the IT, obviously, being October, it's Cybersecurity Month. I know at least our organization is sending out phishing emails. Why? Because that is such a valid way in. We did penetration tests back in the day, and we found out, some information about the company. I think it was like a merger or an acquisition. So we sent tons of emails in addressing that. And that gave us so much access. It was crazy how much people would click on things, and they definitely weren't from the company. We can always patch systems. We have to train users.
It's probably an obvious answer, but why would a hacker, and Bryan, I'll turn to you for this first, why would a hacker want to get into an electric cooperative systems, whether it's their IT or their OT systems? What could they do, and how would they benefit from being inside there?
I'm going to actually say it really depends on the attacker. They range from people that have an agenda to somebody that's just curious. So, there could be somebody that just is going, oh, that's an interesting thing. What can I do with it? And not even thinking about the consequences of where they're at. And then you can also have people that are doing it to be malicious. And with all control systems, they're interconnected to other systems. And it might be that that control system that they have access to isn't their target, but they want to use that to pivot through to another area.
And Ryan, from your perspective, what do you see as sort of the benefit to a hacker for getting into a co-op system?
First and foremost that I've seen is money, right? We all hear ransomware. Last year on the podcast, we talked about ransomware, and we were talking about it with the FBI, and it's very prevalent. I've seen that, I believe in 2019, it was $1 billion industry. Right now, I think it's a $2 billion industry. But there's other things that they do, like for the data, money can be made from selling the data. The PII, personal identifiable information, the sensitive information, that comes at a value. Here's a great reason, because they can. They just want to show that they can. Another one is testing for larger attacks. You want to talk about attacking a small distribution co-op, like a target in that sense, see if their scripts work, see if their attack actually works for a larger scale or something else, right? That could be a reason in which they're getting in there, just to disrupt services. I mean, if you serve internet to rural America, just cutting that, severing the connection to the rest of the world. There's the tarnishing of the reputation of the co-op, right? Maybe someone doesn't like you, or maybe you didn't respond properly during an outage, or whatever the reason is. There's also the idea of a nation state doing their homework, the reconnaissance part of a larger effort or scale. And it doesn't have to be any reason at all. It could simply just be for fun. So it doesn't matter. I know what Bryan said before, where it just depends. There are a lot of dependencies, but those are some of the things that we've seen.
Yeah. Would you say in your experience and knowing what you know about what co-ops do and what utilities do, are utilities particularly attractive targets because they serve sort of critical infrastructure and they provide a service that people can't live without?
Yes. I haven't seen a lot of new things about that, but back when Shodan was brand new in hotness, for those of you who don't know, Shodan is a search engine. It doesn't necessarily find like web pages, it actually finds devices. So I'd actually tell people to look at their own stuff on Shodan. You're not going to expose anything that's not already out there, but it lets you see what other people can see that you have out there. And when that first came out, there was a lot of people finding a lot of control systems. I remember them talking about finding dam controls, all sorts of HVAC systems, different types of PLCs and control systems on there. And when it first came out, it was people just because they could. And then it started getting into people fine-tuning their searches. So they're looking for, say, I want to find Siemens PLCs on there. I want to find things that are talking Modbus. I want to find things that are doing this. And so it started first as, what can I find? To, as Ryan talking about, people doing their homework and going, I want to look for this specific type of thing.
And so, Ryan, what do you see from your perspective?
So mine isn't necessarily that the electric industry isn't necessarily that it's target. It's a target of opportunity. So what happens is you have these automated scripts and automated services out there that are just pinging across the environment to see if someone's front door is open. Once it's open, then that's leveraged or that's attacked, right? So the ones that I've seen are those front doors that are open. They get in and they're able to encrypt their data or do some kind of adversarial work in that environment. But they weren't specifically attacked because they were a co-op. They were attacked because there's an open door, I can get money from them. So there's a few ways to look at it in that sense. Am I saying that people aren't targeting co-ops because of nefarious activities because they are co-ops? Not necessarily, but most of them are targets of opportunity because you have something misconfigured or for some reason something happened that they could get in.
I would agree with Ryan on that. I'll have people asking me, how come they attacked me? Why are they targeting me? And I have to explain to them, it's not you. You just happen to be there.
So as long as we have a white hat hacker and a cybersecurity expert here, why don't we set up sort of a scenario for what an electric co-op would look like to a hacker? So Bryan, I want to start with you. Let's set up a scenario where you're an attacker who wants to, say, steal a bank of credit card numbers or other PPI from an electric co-op. How do you go about it, and where do you start in terms of identifying vulnerabilities that you can exploit?
So if I'm going to target a co-op, the thing that I'm going to be looking at is not necessarily on the control system side, the SCADA side, because, that's not going to be where the billing side is. I'm going to be looking more on the IT side because that's where that type of database would be. So what I'd probably do is start doing some reconnaissance of what IP addresses does this co-op own? What do the email addresses look like? Who works there? Is there any information going on about this co-op in the news, anything that members of the co-op would be interested in that would be hot topics or things like that? Like, did they just recently buy something new? Is there something that I can exploit that way? And I try to do a social engineering way in of being able to phish. I hate using that one, but it works so well because it is so effective. It's still used.
Bryan, let me just jump in real quick. You mentioned social engineering. Can you just kind of describe what that means? I think it sounds like a really grandiose term, but it's a pretty simple concept.
Yeah. So when I think of social engineering, to me, it's just trying to figure out a way that you can talk to somebody and pretend to belong, even though you may not belong, such as knowing that, hey, John down in payroll or Barbara, the admin over in this department, asked me to talk to you. Things like that. It's where you get enough information that you look like you belong, you sound like you belong. It gives the air of authenticity, but it's not there.
Ryan, you're on the good guy's side for this scenario. Based on what Bryan just talked about, is there anything that a co-op could do in real time to detect one of these attacks that he was talking about? Is there anything that they could have done in advance to head it off?
Absolutely. So I call this my boom series. So being military, when an event happens, we call that boom. Whether it's an attack or something happens, there's the boom. And then in this situation, we're talking about cyber event, some kind of information security breach, something along those lines. I call it cyber hits the fan. So there's left of boom, boom, and right of boom. And the concept of left of boom is trying to prepare yourself as much as possible to harden your environments to prevent boom from happening. Train as you fight, so to speak, like we do in the military. Boom is when it happens. A cyber event goes down. What do you do at that point, right? And then there's right of boom. How do we get things back to normal? How do we do lessons learned from it? How do we grow? How do we be better? And then you start the cycle over again. So the question you're asking me, I go straight to left of boom. And left of boom, there's several things that you should do, and it's an ongoing battle, right? Cyber is never completed. But when I start thinking of left of boom and how do I make sure I'm preventing that stuff or having visibility into that stuff or detect the attack like you're asking or repelling, one of the first things I do is two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. It's the idea of authentication into your environment because we're talking about people trying to authenticate or get access to your stuff. So when you think of authentication, you think of something you have, something you know, or something that you are. There's three forms of it. And the goal is to have two of the three. So like a username password, that is something that you know, and a phone is something that you have. Having those two makes it incredibly hard for the attacker to get into your environment, though not impossible. Let's not think that it's the cure-all, right? But that makes it very hard. And when you think of two-factor authentication, you want to make sure that at a minimum, you're thinking of your external facing devices must have that if it's coming into your environment. And internally, you want to make sure your critical systems have it at a minimum. The other thing I want to stress heavily, and this does not help you repel, but it helps you have choices and get back to normal, and that is backups. Backups are absolutely a must-have, and you must test them. This is how you get back to normal. And without this, you are 100% paying the ransom or reinventing the wheel. You have no other options. So someone says, are you going to pay the ransom or you're not going to pay the ransom? I don't know. Do you have backups? You don't have a choice. You pay the ransom, then I don't know. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't work. I don't know. But anyway, circling around back to what he was saying about social engineering, staff education. Now, this is kind of a tricky one, but a lot of people have been working with this so far. The staff education must be done. It has to be constant, right? You can't just do it once and say that it's done. This is a very vigilant effort. What it does is keep cyber up at front of mind, but you have to have a good balance of it. Because if you overdo the phishing, what happens? A legitimate email comes in and they're like, I'm not clicking on that. And it turns into a thing, or people start looking at cyber as a bad thing. and they start thinking of it as a negative thing when it needs to be ingrained into our culture. And speaking of culture, I think that that's probably the next thing is culture of our cybersecurity. We can't be scared of it. Cybersecurity, information security is inherently scary. It is scary when we get attacked. The implications of it and all the ways that they're doing it is scary, and we know that. But we need to be proactive and vigilant with this one, right? And we have to change our culture a little bit to say, hey, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we can be proactive about this and very vigilant. And we do this from the top down and a bottom up approach.
That's awesome. So, Bryan, given everything that Ryan said, and sort of taking into account the sophistication of your average cyber criminal, how would the defenses that Ryan was just talking about make it harder for you on your side?
Oh, everything that Ryan talked about definitely helps. There's a thing that we talk about called defense in depth, and that's where you have a layered approach. As Ryan mentioned, two-factor authentication is very powerful. I've seen a lot of attacks that would have been thwarted because of two-factor authentication. Now, that being said, that is not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. It takes a bunch of different things. The phishing emails, like you said, the training on that. Again, the other thing is I've seen, I would call it anti-phishing emails. It's where we literally get the phishing email test come in, and then not but a day later, I get a legitimate email from my company that looks just like the phishing. And so, not only do we need to be able to identify phishing come in, but we also need to have legitimate stuff be able to look legitimate and not just thrown together. The one thing that I do have to harp on is the defense in depth. Having one thing is just an obstacle I can work around. Having multiple things, it gets exponentially harder because now I have to do something besides compromise an account or find a default account. Now I have to figure out how I can get an account and the second authentication. Maybe it's I trick somebody into giving me the second part of the authentication, whatever that may be. And that's going to take not only more, just technical effort. Now I have to do social effort as well. Or we're just adding more complexity to the attack. And the more complexity that you have to add to the attack, the more likely it is you can find someplace in the, as Ryan was saying, left a boom, that you can stop that chain from happening. More places where you can question it and go, hey, wait, I don't think I should do that. Let me check.
That's awesome. I love that term, left a boom. Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, I want to set up another scenario for Ryan and Bryan to discuss.
Along those lines is made possible by Nokia, who wants you to know that empowering America's electric cooperatives for the new energy future requires a trusted partner that can help you realize your smart grid vision, optimize power distribution, and adapt to changing energy demands by supporting new business models. Nokia can help you achieve these critical objectives with its innovation and technology leadership in mobile, fixed, and cloud networks for electric utilities.
I'm Justin Etter from Craighead Electric Cooperative in Jonesboro, Arkansas. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Why don't we try another scenario? And I wonder if this will kind of create some different reactions in different scenarios. What if, Bryan, you as the hacker want to take control, and Ryan was talking about the SCADA system earlier. What if you wanted to take control of the co-op's SCADA system or a substation or their communications network? Are there other pathways that you would use to get into those?
Yeah, absolutely. On most control systems, there are multiple paths in. A lot of times people don't recognize what that second or the third path might be. We've had a lot of conversation with folks where we talk about, tell me about your control system. Well, it's completely isolated. Okay, but you also mentioned that you had some integrators that would hook in. Yeah, they use this modem over here, and they don't realize that that's an entry point into it. So knowing what entry points are in a system and being able to mitigate different things that could happen with those entry points is a very important thing. Working with ICS CERT, we had a lot of times where control systems were just left on the internet because when control systems were originally built, nobody thought that anybody's going to attack this stuff. Why would anybody want to do that? And we've had to change the thought process on that. If you take a look at what was on the internet, say 5 years ago compared to what's on the internet now, we're definitely heading in the right direction. That doesn't mean that everything's done. It just means that there's less targets that are currently seen. The first thing is if I just want to find somebody, I'm going to probably scour open source options to see what I can find out there. If I'm looking for a specific target, I'm going to have to be a little more targeted on that, of trying to get information about that target, of how I can get on there. If they've successfully put their control system behind a DMZ, behind a bunch of firewalls, then I'm going to have to figure out how to get into possibly their IT systems, find a way that I can pivot. So maybe I need to get into their IT system over to the control system engineer, to his workstation, because that's the one that's allowed to the firewall. And that's going to add a lot more effort on my part.
So, Ryan, sort of the same question for the IT side of the house. What kind of defenses would you need to have in place to keep Bryan out or to detect the attack quickly and then lock him out?
The very first thing that I would do is I would appoint a person to focus in on information security and cybersecurity. And just real quick clarification, information security is including more of like the cyberspace and the physical space. So it's a little bit more of a broad topic than just cybersecurity, because I think it goes a little bit further. So appoint a person, right, to focus in on that and really look into it, because you can't do anything if you don't take ownership of the situation. The second would be a self-assessment. That self-assessment is there to help you and ask the questions of what do you have in your environment? You need to know what you are defending in order to defend it at all. And we're talking about the passwords we said earlier, where people have the default passwords, they didn't even know the device was there or whatever, right? You need to know what you're defending. And if you don't know everything in your environment, you have to do some type of self-assessment. And you need to train the company on basic information. So when social engineering comes, at least we can see it. It may not just be phishing. It may be a phone call. It may be at the bar. It may be wherever at a family thing that they find out. You never know where or what is happening. You just have to be aware of it. Number 4 that I would say is make a cyber incident response plan. If it's going to happen, and it will, cyber does happen. And I try to lock him out. I try to detect him early. But whenever cyber hits the fan, do you have a plan in place to thwart him as fast as possible? Does that make sense? I mean, you can't expect to find them and lock them out unless you have a plan in place to expedite that process. You want to leverage technology, hardware and software. You want to do those things that we all talk about, like antivirus, firewall, all those things, right? You want to leverage technology as much as possible. That really helps. Network segmentation, he just said it. Paths into your environment is very important. This is also called air gapping. But when I was in the military, I went on mission and I found out that they thought they were segmented, like he was saying, but there was a printer that had wireless connections to it that was on both networks. If that printer is then compromised. Additionally, that printer stored data, any scans that it had. You see where I'm going with this? Like, you got to make sure you have proper network segmentation. You don't know what you don't know unless you do some type of like self-assessment or whatever. So network segmentation, the implementation of two-factor authentication. Remember the target of opportunity that we were talking about? This just makes you a little bit harder to attack. You're not an easy target. If the attacker comes in and sees that it's that, they're like, forget it. I'll go to the next one on my list. You know what I'm saying? And then that's just a quick deterrent, is simply having something like that in place. The other one is build observability into your environment. We talked about that. You can't defend your environment if you don't know what right looks like. And the last one, again, I'm going to circle back this in its own podcast in its own, and I won't get into it, promise. But back up your data. Please back up your data.
If I can just kind of shirt tail a little bit onto what Ryan said, I've also done some incident responses. And some of the things that I would probably add to what Ryan said, because everything he said is absolutely on spot. Some of the things that are really important to cybersecurity are also the things that are not fun, not sexy. There are things such as asset management, knowing what devices you have and where they're at, log monitoring, being on site at some incident responses where we already know that this place has been compromised. We go in, take a look, and part of the thing is trying to figure out how long they've been compromised. And I remember one of them, we got on, and the farthest the logs went back was like 6 or 8 months. And at that time, we could tell that the adversary had already been well into the system, and any of the logs before them have gone. So there's no way to tell how long they had an adversary walking through their systems. Their logs were telling you right there that it wasn't hard to find, but nobody was checking the logs.
Honestly, Ryan, what you said earlier about we could do a separate podcast. There's about 10 different things that we've talked about today that I think we could do a podcast on. Before I let you go, I wanted to sort of get a bottom line from you, and we'll start with you, Bryan. You know, hackers are, we've said it several times, they're not going to go away. They're not going to give up. They're always going to be there. They're going to get more sophisticated. What's sort of the best advice you can give to utilities specifically? Let them keep a half a step ahead as these hackers continue to up their game.
So the biggest thing I would say is defense in depth. And that's where you make a layered approach. You may have a hole in one spot, but if you have another spot that covers it, it makes it a lot easier to protect. You know, we only have so many resources to protect our assets. A hacker really only has so many resources to attack your assets. And so you're never going to be perfect all the time, but if you can be perfect enough of the time, you can make it hard. And then backups. Have a contingency plan for when it fails, because it will fail. One of the other ththings that I would suggest, as we talked about training, there's a lot of free training available. At the Idaho National Lab, we do a class called 301. They also call it Red Blue. But in the 301 training, they take part of the class and make them attackers. And then when they get done, they have people defending a control system and people attacking a control system. And they share notes and they learn a lot from this class.
All right. What about you, Ron?
The last thing that I would probably say, and I try to be positive and motivating as much as possible, you are not alone. There are other co-ops out there. We have that concern for community. We have the cooperation among cooperatives. We have the autonomy and independence. We live by the cooperative principles. If we can come together collectively and communicate and talk about our hardships and be honest with those things and come together collectively to approach this, it makes it more achievable and it helps us from being afraid. And if we do it collectively and share with one another in the co-op space, as the backbone of the electric industry, the not-for-profit co-ops are, and that's what we do, it's in our blood, is come together. And just don't be afraid of it. Be vigilant and proactive.
That's a great point and a great place to end. Like I said, we could talk about it all day. I love this stuff, and you guys are really fun to talk to. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hey, I wanted to give a quick shout out to my local co-op, Fall River Rural Electric. They're one of your members. I really appreciate them. They're very community minded. They've given a lot of scholarships and do a lot in the community. So I just wanted to plug them and hopefully I can help them out a little bit by doing this podcast for you guys.
Awesome. Thanks. We always love a good shout out for co-op. And thanks to you, our listeners, and to our sponsor, Nokia, for cybersecurity. For more on this and other podcasts, visit us at electric.coop. Until next time, for Along Those Lines, I'm Scott Hoffman.
I'm Brianna Wall from Oklahoma Electric Cooperative in Norman, Oklahoma. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.